The dense woodlands of Appalachian Virginia, cloaked in the ethereal mist of an early spring morning, stood quiet but alive with secrets. The sun's hesitant rays struggled to pierce through the towering pines, painting the forest floor in a mosaic of shadows and light. The scene, tranquil and unassuming, would soon transform into the stage for a tale so profound it would ripple through the hearts of everyone who heard it. Nestled at the edge of these woods was the small town of Willow Creek, where time seemed to move slower, and every face was a familiar one. Life here was simple, but the woods, they held their own mysteries. Some whispered over campfires, others buried in old, forgotten folklore. But none had ever prepared the townsfolk for the story they were about to witness, the story of 10 dogs and a stranger who appeared from nowhere. Our story begins with the Maddox family. Caroline Maddox, a widow in her early 40s, was a fixture in the town. After losing her husband Ethan to a tragic accident 6 years ago, she found solace in her role as the town's veterinarian. Her days were spent mending broken wings, treating stray cats, and easing the pain of aging dogs. To Caroline, animals were more than just patients. They were family, companions who didn't demand much beyond love and care. But in the years since her loss, she'd built an emotional wall around her, retreating from the human connections she once cherished. Caroline's only family now was her 10 dogs, a diverse and unruly pack she'd rescued over the years. Each had a story: a limping golden retriever named Samson, abandoned after a car accident; a deaf Dalmatian named Pippa, rejected by her breeder; and a scruffy mutt named Max, who had once been tied to a tree and left to starve. Each of these dogs had found a second chance with Caroline, and together they filled the emptiness of her home with barks, wagging tails, and the kind of unconditional love only animals can give. The dogs were more than just pets. They were her protectors, her confidants, her lifeline. She called them her pack, and they followed her everywhere. Each morning, rain or shine, Caroline and her dogs took the same trail into the woods. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely, away from the well-meaning but prying eyes of the townsfolk. On this particular morning, however, the woods felt different. The air was thick, not just with mist, but with an unshakable tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The dogs, usually playful and eager, were unusually quiet, their ears pricked and noses to the ground. Caroline noticed it immediately. Samson, the leader of the pack, was on edge, his amber eyes scanning the trees with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What is it, boy?" Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Samson didn't respond. Instead, he let out a low growl, a sound that made the rest of the pack freeze in their tracks. Before Caroline could process what was happening, the dogs darted ahead, their synchronized movement a testament to their bond. "Wait!" she called, sprinting after them, her boots crunching against the damp forest floor. When she finally caught up to them, the sight before her made her heart lurch. The dogs had formed a tight circle, their bodies tense and their tails stiff. They were growling, not in aggression, but in a protective, almost defensive way. And in the middle of that circle lay something, or someone. Caroline's breath hitched as she approached. It was a man, barely conscious, his clothes tattered and caked in dirt. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his hands clutched a bundle of something wrapped in an old, frayed blanket. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting Caroline's gaze with a mix of desperation and relief before closing again. Caroline knelt beside him, her medical instincts kicking in. "Hey, can you hear me?" she asked, gently shaking his shoulder. He groaned softly but didn't respond. The dogs, sensing Caroline's intent, relaxed slightly but remained vigilant, their eyes darting between the man and the surrounding trees, as if they were guarding him from an unseen threat. As she checked his pulse and examined the bundle in his arms, her fingers brushed against the fabric of the blanket. It was damp and smelled of mildew, but beneath it she felt warmth. Carefully, she peeled back a corner of the cloth, revealing a pair of tiny, frightened eyes staring back at her. It was a baby. Caroline's heart stopped. She looked back at the man, trying to piece together the scene before her. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why was he here in the middle of the woods, clutching an infant like his life depended on it? The dogs began to whine, their unease growing as the forest seemed to close in around them. Caroline knew she couldn't stay here. The man and the baby needed help, and they needed it fast. But as she prepared to call for assistance, a single haunting thought crossed her mind. What could drive a man into the heart of these woods, risking his own life and that of a child? She had no idea that the answer to that question would unravel a story so heartbreaking and beautiful, it would change her life and the lives of her beloved dogs forever. The baby's cry pierced through the silence of the woods like a fragile thread unraveling in a storm. Caroline held her breath, her mind racing as she gently adjusted the blanket around the tiny child, whose cheeks were flushed red from cold and hunger. She glanced at the unconscious man, his chest rising and falling faintly, his face pale as a ghost. Whoever he was, whatever had brought him here, he didn't have much time. Her pack of dogs encircled them protectively, forming a barrier between Caroline and the thick forest. Samson, the ever-watchful golden retriever, stood closest, his head low and ears perked, while Pippa, the deaf Dalmatian, seemed to sense the tension without needing to hear the sounds of the forest. The rest of the dogs stayed close, their hackles raised, occasionally letting out low growls as if warning the woods themselves to stay away. Caroline fumbled for her phone, but a sinking feeling overtook her as she pulled it from her pocket. No signal. Of course, deep in these woods, the towering trees had always rendered cell service useless. Her next thought was to get the man and baby back to her house, but that was at least a mile away, and the man was in no condition to walk. She needed a plan, and she needed it now. The man stirred weakly, his lips parting as he tried to speak. Caroline leaned closer, straining to hear. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Help her," he rasped, his hand weakly motioning toward the baby. "I will," Caroline assured him, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "But I need to get you both out of here. Can you move?" He shook his head almost imperceptibly, his body slumping further into the ground. Caroline bit her lip, panic creeping in at the edges of her resolve. She had no idea what kind of danger he might be in. Internal injuries, hypothermia, dehydration, and the baby's frail cries only heightened her sense of urgency. Okay, she murmured more to herself than anyone else. She looked at Samson, who seemed to understand her without needing words. "Stay with him," she commanded, her voice firm. The retriever stepped closer to the man, his large, warm body pressing against him as if to share his strength. Caroline scooped up the baby, cradling her close to her chest. The infant was impossibly light, her tiny hands curling instinctively against Caroline's jacket. She felt the baby's warmth against her skin and the rapid flutter of her heartbeat, so small yet so fierce. It ignited something in Caroline, a maternal instinct she thought she'd buried long ago, a fire she hadn't felt since she lost her own unborn child years before. "Come on, we're going to get help," Caroline said, more determined now. She turned to the rest of the dogs, motioning for them to follow her. "Let's go." The woods seemed darker now, the shadows longer and more oppressive. Every step Caroline took felt heavier, the uneven ground threatening to trip her with each stride. The baby's cries had quieted, but her shallow breaths were a constant reminder of how little time they had. Behind her, the dogs were restless. Pippa barked sharply, her body stiff as she turned toward the trees. Max, the scruffy mutt, growled low, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. Caroline stopped, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. The dogs barked again, louder this time, their focus fixed on something Caroline couldn't see. The forest, once still and silent, now felt alive with movement. Branches rustled and the faint sound of snapping twigs reached Caroline's ears. She tightened her grip on the baby, her breath hitching as fear clawed its way into her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the trees. There was no response, only the sound of the wind and the restless barking of her dogs. Suddenly, Samson appeared at her side, his golden fur bristling. He nudged her leg urgently, as if to say, "Move now." Trusting his instincts, Caroline quickened her pace, her dogs forming a protective circle around her. Whatever was out there, she didn't want to find out. Finally, the trees began to thin, and Caroline spotted the faint outline of her home through the mist. Relief washed over her like a wave. She sprinted the last few yards, her dogs flanking her every step of the way. Bursting through the back door, Caroline laid the baby down on the couch, carefully unwrapping the blanket. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her tiny fingers clutching at the air as if searching for something or someone. Caroline's heart ached as she thought of the man still lying in the woods. She had to go back for him, but first she needed to ensure the baby was safe. After checking the baby's vitals as best she could and wrapping her in a fresh blanket, Caroline grabbed a first aid kit and whistled for Samson and Max. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice firm. The dogs followed her without hesitation, their loyalty unwavering. The journey back into the woods felt longer, the growing darkness wrapping around them like a shroud. Caroline's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And why had he risked everything to protect this baby? When they reached the spot where she'd left him, Caroline's stomach dropped. The man was gone. Her dogs began to bark furiously, sniffing the ground and darting in circles, as if trying to pick up his scent. Caroline knelt, her hands trembling as she examined the area. There were drag marks in the dirt, as if someone or something had pulled him away. Fear gripped her, but it was quickly replaced by determination. Whoever this man was, whatever had happened to him, she owed it to him, and to the baby, to find out. The dogs looked up at her, their eyes filled with the same resolve. They were her pack, her family, and they would see this through together. The forest felt colder now, the air biting against Caroline's skin as she scanned the shadows for any sign of the man. The drag marks on the ground veered off to the west, deeper into the woods where the trees grew closer together and the light barely reached. Her chest tightened as she looked at Samson, who stood silently by the marks, his nose pressed to the ground. "Bind him, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. Samson sniffed the air, his ears twitching, and with a low bark, he took off, leading the way. Max and Pippa followed close behind, their instincts sharper than ever, while Caroline hurried after them, gripping the flashlight she had hastily grabbed from the kitchen. The woods seemed alive with whispers, the faint rustling of leaves and the creaking of branches creating a symphony of unease. Caroline's mind raced with possibilities. What had happened to the man? Had he regained consciousness and wandered off? Or had someone, or something, taken him? She tried to focus on the task at hand, pushing her fears aside. As they followed the trail, the dogs suddenly stopped, their bodies tense, their ears perked. Samson let out a sharp bark, his tail stiff as he stared ahead. Caroline raised her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and her heart sank. There, slumped against the base of a massive oak tree, was the man. His head lolled to the side, his body limp, and his face pale as the moonlight filtering through the branches. But that wasn't what made Caroline's breath catch in her throat. Surrounding him, barely visible in the dim light, were footprints. Dozens of them, large and heavy, as if someone had been circling him. Caroline approached cautiously, her dogs flanking her protectively. She knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. It was weak but steady. His clothes were damp with sweat, and his skin was ice cold to the touch. She shook him gently, her voice urgent. "Hey, can you hear me? You need to wake up." His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked at her with an expression of pure terror. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't let them take her." "Who's coming?" Caroline asked, her voice sharp with urgency. But the man's head fell back and he slipped into unconsciousness again. Caroline's dogs began to growl, their bodies tense and their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tree. A low, guttural sound echoed through the woods, a sound that sent chills down Caroline's spine. It wasn't a growl or a howl. It was something inhuman, something primal. "Samson," Caroline whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." But Samson didn't move. He stood his ground, his teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Max and Pippa joined him, their eyes scanning the darkness as the sound grew louder, closer. Caroline's heart pounded as she looked around, her flashlight flickering in her shaking hand. And then she saw them. Emerging from the shadows were figures, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in tattered cloaks that seemed to blend into the forest. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate, almost predatory. There were 3 of them, and they moved silently, their feet barely making a sound against the forest floor. Caroline froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, her mind racing. Who were these people? What did they want? And why were they here, in the middle of the woods, circling this man like vultures? One of the figures stepped closer, their hooded head tilting as if studying her. Caroline felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for the man but for the baby waiting for her at home. She couldn't let anything happen, not to them, not to her dogs. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice echoing through the trees. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they moved closer, their movements eerily synchronized. Samson let out a fierce bark, stepping forward to place himself between Caroline and the strangers. Max and Pippa followed suit, their growls reverberating through the night. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures stopped. For a moment, the woods were silent, the tension so thick it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. The lead figure raised a hand pointing toward Caroline. In a voice that was low and chilling, they spoke a single sentence: "The child does not belong to you." Caroline's blood ran cold. She tightened her grip on the man's arm, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took another step forward, their presence suffocating. The dogs barked furiously, their bodies bristling as they prepared to defend Caroline. And then, in an instant, the figures turned and vanished into the trees. Their movements so swift and silent it was as if they had dissolved into the shadows. The forest fell silent again, but the air was thick with unease. Caroline didn't wait to see if they would return. She hooked her arms under the man's shoulders, struggling to lift him as she whispered commands to her dogs. "Samson, Max, guard me. Pippa, lead the way." Together, they made their way back through the woods, Caroline's legs trembling under the weight of the man and her own fear. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches sent her heart racing, but she pressed on, driven by the desperate need to protect the baby. And now this man. When they finally reached her house, Caroline collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air. She dragged the man inside, locking the door behind her and leaning against it, her body shaking. The baby's cries filled the room, pulling Caroline back to the present. She looked at the infant, her tiny hands reaching out as if sensing Caroline's presence. Tears welled in Caroline's eyes as she cradled the baby, her heart breaking under the weight of everything that had happened. Who were those people? What did they want with this child? And why had this man risked everything to protect her? As the baby settled in her arms, Caroline looked at her pack of dogs, their loyal eyes watching her intently. Whatever answers lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't facing this alone. The next few hours were a blur of frantic effort and quiet tension. Caroline worked tirelessly, her hands trembling as she treated the man's wounds. He had a gash on his head, likely from falling, and his body showed signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion. She fed him water in small sips, using a syringe to ensure he didn't choke, and covered him with blankets to stave off the cold. All the while, the baby slept fitfully on the couch, her soft cries occasionally breaking the silence of the room. The dogs stayed close, their eyes flicking between the windows and the man on the floor. Samson positioned himself at the front door, his large body a shield against whatever might come next. Pippa lay beside the baby, her head resting on the couch, while Max patrolled the perimeter of the room, his movements restless and sharp. They knew danger was still out there, lingering in the shadows. Hours later, just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, the man stirred. His eyes opened slowly, confusion and fear flickering across his face before he locked onto Caroline. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his cracked lips parted. "The baby?" he whispered hoarsely. "Is she okay?" "She's fine," Caroline said gently, pulling a chair closer to him. "She's safe. You're safe. But you need to tell me what's going on. Who are you? Why were you in the woods with her?" The man's eyes filled with tears as he tried to sit up, wincing in pain. Caroline helped him into a semi-reclined position, waiting patiently as he gathered himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Daniel," he began. "The baby? Her name is Lily. She's my daughter." His voice broke on the last word, and he paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "We've been running for weeks. I didn't know where else to go." "Running from what?" Caroline pressed. her heart sinking as she remembered the hooded figures in the woods. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the window, his expression haunted. From them, from people who think Lily belongs to them. They're part of some cult, a group that believes Lily is special, that she's the answer to some prophecy or something. My wife. He choked on the word, his hands clenching into fists. They killed her, trying to take Lily. I barely got away. Caroline's stomach twisted as she listened. She thought of the hooded figures in the woods, their chilling words echoing in her mind. The child does not belong to you. They've been following us ever since, Daniel continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. I tried to stay off the grid, to keep moving, but they always found us. Last night I realized they were close again. I ran into the woods, hoping to lose them. I thought I could keep her safe. He looked down at his hands, his voice trembling. But I couldn't. I passed out before I could get her to safety. If it weren't for you and your dogs. Caroline felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Daniel, his face etched with guilt and desperation. She thought of Lily, so small and innocent, caught in a nightmare she couldn't possibly understand. And she thought of the hooded figures, their ominous presence a lingering threat. You're not alone anymore, Caroline said firmly, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. We'll keep her safe. I'll keep both of you safe. Before Daniel could respond, Samson let out a sharp bark, his body stiff as he stared at the front door. Max and Pippa quickly joined him, their growls low and menacing. Caroline's heart raced as she grabbed the shotgun she kept above the fireplace, a relic of her late husband's, dusty from years of disuse but still functional. They're here, Daniel whispered, his face pale. Caroline's grip tightened on the shotgun as she motioned for Daniel to stay put. She moved to the door, her dogs flanking her, their bodies tense and ready. Through the frosted glass, she saw shadows moving, figures circling the house just as they had in the woods. Caroline, Daniel said urgently, his voice trembling. They won't stop. They'll do whatever it takes to get her. Let them try, Caroline said, her voice steely. The first knock came, soft but deliberate. Caroline raised the shotgun, her heart pounding. Who's there? She called out, her voice strong despite the fear tightening her chest. There was no answer, only another knock, louder this time. The dogs barked furiously, their teeth bared, their growls filling the room. Caroline's finger hovered over the trigger as she braced herself. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The shadows outside the window retreated, melting into the early morning light. For a moment, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice shaky. They're not gone. They're waiting. Caroline lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling. She knew he was right. The hooded figures might have retreated for now, but they would be back. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But Caroline wasn't about to let that happen. She turned to Daniel, her eyes fierce. We're not going to let them take her. Do you hear me? We'll protect her. Daniel nodded, his face a mixture of fear and determination. He reached for Lily, cradling her close as tears streamed down his face. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for saving us. Caroline looked at her pack of dogs, their loyal eyes fixed on her, their bodies ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. They had already proven their courage, their unyielding devotion. Together they would face whatever came next. That morning, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Caroline began to form a plan. She didn't know how long they could stay in Willow Creek, but she knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. The hooded figures might have believed they were unstoppable, but they hadn't counted on one thing: Caroline's unwavering determination and the fierce loyalty of her pack. Because this wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about love, about family, about standing up against the darkness and protecting the innocent. And for Caroline, for Daniel, for Lily, and for the 10 dogs who had become more than just companions, this was a battle they were ready to fight. The morning sun cast its golden light across the small living room, illuminating the faces of those inside. Daniel sat on the couch with Lily cradled in his arms, her tiny hand clutching at his shirt as she slept. The man looked worn but resolute, his fear tempered by the newfound sense of safety he felt under Caroline's roof. He glanced over at Caroline, who was kneeling beside Samson, gently stroking his fur. The golden retriever rested his head in her lap, his amber eyes watching her with the unshakable trust of a dog who had given everything to protect his family. The house was quiet now, but the silence felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. The hooded figures hadn't returned, but their presence lingered like a shadow, a dark promise that they weren't finished. Caroline knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. But as she looked around the room, at Daniel's determined face, at Lily's peaceful slumber, at the 10 dogs sprawled across the floor, their bodies tired but ready to fight again if needed, Caroline felt something she hadn't in years: hope. In the days that followed, Caroline, Daniel, and the dogs worked together to prepare for whatever might come next. Caroline contacted a trusted friend, a former law enforcement officer who lived in the neighboring town, to help set up security around the property. Daniel began regaining his strength, his bond with Lily growing even deeper as he allowed himself to believe, for the first time in weeks, that they might have a future. And the dogs? They became guardians in every sense of the word. Each had their role. Samson was the leader, ever watchful and brave. Pippa, though deaf, had an uncanny sense of danger and became the alert. Max, with his scrappy determination, patrolled the edges of the property like a sentry. Together, the pack moved as one, their loyalty to Caroline and her new makeshift family unshakable. But as the days stretched into weeks, something else began to happen. Caroline's walls, the one she'd built around her heart after losing her husband and her unborn child, began to crumble. In Lily's laughter, she found the echoes of a life she thought she'd lost forever. In Daniel's gratitude and quiet strength, she found a connection she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. And in the unwavering loyalty of her dogs, she found the courage to believe that even in the face of darkness, love and family could endure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the woods came alive with the sound of crickets, Caroline sat on the porch with Lily in her arms. The baby giggled, her tiny fingers tugging at Caroline's hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Caroline laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for too long. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, his eyes soft as he watched the scene before him. "You saved us," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Caroline looked at him, then down at Lily, and finally at the dogs sprawled around their feet, their watchful eyes scanning the darkening woods. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We saved each other." And in that moment, as the last light of day faded into the comforting darkness of night, Caroline knew they would face whatever came next, together. Because family wasn't just about blood or circumstance. It was about love, about loyalty, and about never giving up on those who mattered most. The hooded figures might still be out there, but so was the strength of a woman, a man, a baby, and a pack of 10 extraordinary dogs. Together, they were a force no darkness could ever hope to overcome.